3 feet. That was the distance between keeping your job and losing everything. At Thorne Enterprises, rule number 1 wasn't just a guideline. It was a survival instinct. Do not touch the boss. Adrian Thorne wasn't just a CEO. They called him the Ice King. He treated human contact like a contagion. One accidental brush of his shoulder, and security would be escorting you out before you could even apologize. For Elena, that rule was the only thing standing between her family and financial ruin. She was the invisible girl, the one who mastered the art of walking on eggshells. But on a Tuesday morning, inside a silent boardroom filled with investors, physics decided to ruin her life. It happened in slow motion. The sickening snap of a cheap heel. The loss of balance. Elena squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the humiliation. She waited to hit the cold floor. She waited for the words, "You're fired." But she never hit the ground. Instead, a hand slammed around her waist, a band of steel. She gasped and looked up, and the entire room went deadly silent, because the man holding her, the man pressing her body flush against his fingers digging into her waist with a desperate, terrifying hunger, was the one man who was never supposed to break. But what he whispered to her next? No one saw it coming. Now, before I tell you what happened when the silence broke, I need to ask you something. If you have ever felt like you're carrying the weight of the world on your own, or if you have ever secretly wished for someone strong enough to catch you when you fall, I want you to hit that like button right now. Make it turn white. Prove that you still believe in that kind of safety. And if you're new here, subscribe. This isn't just a channel. It's a place for those of us who feel deeply. Join us. Okay, let's go back to the boardroom. The broken heel. The forbidden touch. And the moment the Ice King finally started to burn. Thorne Enterprises wasn't just a corporate office. It was a cathedral of silence built from glass and steel. The air inside the headquarters was always set to a temperature that felt unnaturally crisp, a physical manifestation of the man who ruled from the 42nd floor. They called him the Ice King. It was a nickname whispered in the break rooms and typed into group chats that vanished as soon as a manager walked by, but everyone knew it fit him perfectly. Adrian Thorne was a man carved from marble and money, possessing a face that could launch 1,000 mergers and a gaze that could freeze a heartbeat in a chest. He was efficient, brilliant, and terrifyingly distant. But his reputation wasn't built solely on his ruthless business acumen or his ability to dismantle competitors with a single phone call. It was built on a single, inviolable law that governed every soul in the building. Rule number 1. Do not touch the boss. It sounded simple, perhaps even ridiculous, to outsiders who didn't understand the ecosystem of fear that Adrian cultivated. But inside these walls, it was a commandment written in stone. No handshakes, no accidental brushes in the crowded elevator, no tapping his shoulder to get his attention during a noisy drill. The distance was absolute. 3 feet of air had to exist between Adrian and the rest of humanity at all times. To breach that gap was to sign your own termination letter. There were stories, of course, dark urban legends of a junior executive who had once slapped Adrian on the back after a successful deal and was escorted out by security 5 minutes later, his career effectively vaporized. The rule wasn't just a preference, it was a survival instinct for everyone else. Then there was Elena. She was the shadow in the corner, the quiet force that kept Adrian's schedule from collapsing into chaos. She wasn't high-ranking enough to be feared by the board, but she was close enough to the sun to get burned if she made a mistake. She needed this job. The medical bills on her kitchen counter were a mounting tide that threatened to drown her family, and the salary at Thorne Enterprises was the only life raft she had. So, she mastered the art of invisibility. She learned to slide files onto his desk without her fingers lingering near his. She learned to walk in sync with his long strides, always trailing, always maintaining that sacred buffer zone. She became a dancer in a choreography of avoidance, treating him like a volatile explosive that could detonate with the slightest vibration. It was a Tuesday that felt like a guillotine waiting to drop. The board of directors was gathered in the main conference room, a shark tank of investors waiting for blood. Adrian was already inside, the The heavy oak doors shut tight against the outer office. But on Elena's desk sat the Q3 projection file, the single most important document of the quarter, which had been updated with critical data at the last second. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the ammunition Adrian needed to survive the meeting. The intercom on her desk buzzed, his voice sharp and distorted by the static, cutting through the silence like a knife. The file, Elena. Now. Panic is a cold water shock, and it hits her instantly. Elena grabbed the thick folder, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She smoothed her skirt, took a deep breath, and moved. She had to enter the lion's den, deliver the file, and vanish before the air conditioning could even register her body heat. She pushed open the heavy double doors. The room fell silent. 12 pairs of eyes turned to her, analyzing, judging. Adrian stood at the head of the long obsidian table, his hand extended, waiting. He looked impatient, a storm gathering behind his gray eyes. Elena hurried. She knew the terrain, the plush carpet that transitioned into the slick, polished marble of the presentation area. She had walked this path 100 times, but today, the universe decided to rewrite the laws of physics. It happened in slow motion, a nightmare unfolding frame by frame. Her right heel, a cheap pair she had resold twice to save money, caught the edge of the metal transition strip. There was a sickening snap. Balance is a fragile thing, and Elena lost hers instantly. Gravity took hold, dragging her forward. She gasped, the sound tearing through the silent room. She saw the floor rushing up to meet her. She braced for the impact, for the humiliation of sprawling out in front of the city's most powerful men, for the inevitable scattering of papers that would mark the end of her employment. She closed her eyes tight, waiting for the pain. But the floor never came. Instead of cold marble, she collided with something solid and incredibly warm. The impact knocked the wind out of her, but she didn't fall. A band of iron clamped around her waist, halting her descent with jarring force. Her hands, flailing for purchase, slapped against a chest that felt like a stone wall beneath a fine silk shirt. The silence in the room transformed from attentive to suffocated. Elena opened her eyes, her breath catching in her throat. She wasn't looking at the floor. She was looking up, straight into the shocked, widened eyes of Adrian Thorne. He had moved. In the split second between her trip and her fall, the man who treated distance like a religion had lunged forward. He had caught her. The contact was electric, a sudden, violent surge of heat that seemed to sear through the layers of her clothing. His large hand was splayed across the curve of her waist, his fingers digging in, gripping her with a strength that was terrified and possessive all at once. It was a violation of every rule, every protocol, every boundary he had spent years erecting. For a heartbeat, time was suspended. Logic dictated he should let go immediately. He should recoil as if burned. But he didn't. For 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. He held her there, suspended inches off the ground, her body pressed flush against his. The smell of him, rich sandalwood and cold rain, flooded her senses. She could feel the rapid, thundering beat of his heart against her palms, a frantic rhythm that betrayed his icy exterior. His pupils blew wide, swallowing the gray. And for a terrifying moment, he looked down at her not with disgust, but with a hunger so raw it made her knees weak. Then, reality snapped back into place. Adrian seemed to wake up from a trance. He shoved her away, not gently, but with a force that sent her stumbling back until she regained her footing. He retreated, putting the table between them, his chest heaving. The room was deadly quiet. No one moved. Elena stood there, trembling, her skin still burning where his hand had been. She clutched the file to her chest, waiting for the words, waiting for him to point to the door and end her livelihood. But Adrian wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his own hand, the one that had saved her. He stared at his palm as if it were covered in blood, his expression twisting into something unrecognizable, confusion, horror, and something else entirely. He looked like a man who had just discovered fire. He didn't speak. He just stared at his hand, then slowly, agonizingly, lifted his gaze back to her. "Get out." The words were spoken softly, barely rising above a whisper, but in the acoustic perfection of the boardroom, they sounded like a thunderclap. Adrian hadn't turned around. He was still facing Elena, his back to the 12 most powerful investors in the city. The air in the room seemed to vibrate with the aftershocks of the incident. The board members, men and women who controlled billions in assets, looked at one another in bewildered silence. Usually, Adrian Thorne was a man of protocol. He respected time, money, and hierarchy. Dismissing a board meeting because a secretary tripped was not just uncharacteristic, it was insanity. "Mr. Thorne," the senior director began, his voice wavering slightly, "we haven't finished the Q3 review. If we leave now," I said. Adrian turned his head, his profile sharp and unforgiving against the backdrop of the city skyline. "Get out. All of you. Leave the files. I will review them alone." It wasn't a request. It was an eviction. The scraping of chairs against the floor was the only sound that dared to compete with the humming tension. Papers were shuffled, briefcases snapped shut, and within 60 seconds, the room was empty. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut with a finality that made Elena flinch. She was alone with him. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against her ears like deep water. She stood frozen, her hands still clutching the folder to her chest as if it were a shield. She waited for the explosion. She waited for him to tell her that her clumsiness had cost the company face, that she was a liability, and that she needed to clear her desk immediately. "Sit down," Adrian said. He didn't look at her. He walked over to the sidebar, where a crystal pitcher of water sat on a silver tray. "Sir, I'm so sorry. I can leave. I didn't mean to." "Sit down, Elena." He poured a glass of water, his movements precise and controlled, though Elena noticed the water in the glass trembled ever so slightly as he set it on the table. She sank into the nearest leather chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a shaky exhaustion. But more than the fear, she was consumed by the sensation that was still ghosting over her skin. Her waist burned. It was a phantom pressure, a distinct memory of 5 fingers digging into her side, pulling her against a body that was forbidden territory. Adrian slid the glass across the polished table toward her. He didn't come close. He stayed on his side of the divide, leaning back against the edge of the table, crossing his arms. He looked at her, really looked at her, in a way he never had before. Usually, she was part of the furniture, a tool to be used. Now, she was a variable that had disrupted his equation. "Are you injured?" he asked. His voice was devoid of warmth, stripped of emotion, returning to the metallic timbre she was used to. "No, sir. Just shaken." "Good. Drink." She drank. The cool water did little to quell the heat rising in her cheeks. As she sipped, her mind raced through the office lore, trying to reconcile the man who had just saved her with the monster in the stories. There were 1,000 rumors about why Adrian Thorne couldn't be touched. The older employees whispered about a germ phobia, a clinical obsession with sterility. The darker rumors, the ones traded over drinks at happy hour, spoke of a past betrayal. They said a woman, a fiancé or a business partner, the story changed depending on who told it, had used intimacy as a weapon. She had gotten close, physically and emotionally, only to dismantle him from the inside out. They said the Ice King persona wasn't arrogance, it was a scar. It was a fortress built to ensure that no one could ever get close enough to stick a knife in his ribs again. Looking at him now, watching the tight line of his jaw and the defensive posture of his crossed arms, Elena felt a sudden, dangerous pang of sympathy. He didn't look like a king. He looked like a man who was terrified of the variable he couldn't control. He looked lonely. "Go back to your desk," he said suddenly, pushing off the table. He turned his back to her, staring out the window at the sprawling city below. "Take the rest of the hour. Compose yourself." Am I fired, Mr. Thorne?" she asked, her voice small. He didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched, agonizing and thick. "No," he finally said, his voice low. "Just go." Elena fled. Returning to her desk felt like walking onto a stage. The outer office was buzzing. The board members had walked out past the secretarial pool looking confused and irritated, and the rumor mill was already spinning at Mach speed. Did she spill coffee on him? Did she drop the projector? Did he finally snap? Elena kept her head down, ignoring the prying eyes of the other assistants. She sat at her computer, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, but she couldn't type. Her body felt different. The no-touch rule had been a law of nature, like gravity. Now that it had been broken, the world felt tilted. She felt a prickle on the back of her neck, a sensation of being watched. Slowly, she lifted her head and looked toward the large glass wall that separated the open office from the CEO's sanctuary. Usually, the blinds were drawn, or Adrian was buried in paperwork, oblivious to the ants marching outside. Today, he was standing right at the glass. He was staring directly at her. He wasn't working. He wasn't on the phone. He was just standing there, one hand in his pocket, the other resting flat against the glass pane, watching her. The distance between them was safe again, glass and air, but his gaze felt tactile. It felt heavy. He wasn't looking at her like a boss looks at an employee. He was looking at her like a scientist looking at a new, volatile element. When their eyes met, he didn't look away. He held her gaze for a long, suffocating moment before turning and disappearing into the depths of his office. The rest of the day was a blur of anxiety. Every time her phone rang, she jumped. Every time an email pinged, she expected it to be HR processing her exit. The sun began to set, casting long, orange shadows across the office floor. The other employees began to pack up, whispering their goodbyes, leaving Elena in the quiet hum of the evening. She was just shutting down her computer when the intercom buzzed. "Elena, come in here." Her heart dropped into her stomach. This was it. He had let her cool down. He had waited for the office to clear out to avoid a scene, and now he was going to let her go. She picked up her purse, convinced she wouldn't be returning to this desk tomorrow. She walked to the heavy door, knocked once, and entered. The office was dim, lit only by a desk lamp and the city lights outside. Adrian was sitting behind his desk, a single sheet of paper in front of him. He looked up as she entered. His face was unreadable, the mask firmly back in place. "Sit," he commanded. She sat. She braced herself. "Mr. Thorne, about this morning, I want to assure you that I'm promoting you," he interrupted. Elena blinked. The words didn't make sense. Excuse me? My current executive assistant is being transferred to the London branch." Adrian lied smoothly. They both knew his current EA had been there for 10 years and had family in the city. "I need someone new. Someone who is already familiar with my schedule. Someone who can handle high-pressure situations." "You want me to be your executive assistant?" Elena asked, stunned. "But that role requires traveling with you, managing your personal affairs. Being by your side is almost 24/7. "Correct," Adrian said. He leaned forward, the light from the lamp catching the intense gray of his eyes. "The salary is triple what you make now. Full benefits. A company car." "Why?" Elena whispered. It was the only question that mattered. She was the girl who tripped. She was the girl who broke the one rule he held sacred. She was the walking disaster. Adrian looked at her, his gaze dropping for a fraction of a second to her waist, then snapping back to her eyes. He couldn't tell her the truth. He couldn't tell her that for 3 seconds, the static noise in his head had gone silent. He couldn't tell her that her skin felt like an anchor in a world that usually felt like it was spinning too fast. He couldn't tell her that he was terrified to let her leave because she was the only thing he had touched in 10 years that didn't make him want to wash his hands. "Because you're efficient," he said coldly. "And because you owe me. I saved you from a concussion today. Now you can repay the debt by ensuring my life runs smoothly. Do you accept it?" Elena looked at the contract he slid across the desk. It was a deal with the devil. It meant entering the dragon's lair every single day. It meant being closer to the fire than anyone else. But she thought of the medical bills. She thought of her empty bank account. "I accept," she said. "Good," Adrian said, leaning back into the shadows. "Be here at 7 a.m. sharp. And Elena?" She paused at the door. "Yes, sir." "Do not trip again." But the promotion was a trap. What happened in the back seat of his car would blur the lines between professional and personal forever. And the mistake Elena makes during a thunderstorm? It changes everything. The promotion changed everything, and yet, it changed nothing at all. The geography of Elena's life had shifted from the outer orbit of the secretarial pull to the intense, gravitational center of Adrian Thorne's existence. Being his executive assistant wasn't just a job title, it was an immersion. It meant that the physical distance between them, once measured in office walls and closed doors, was now measured in inches. The company car, a sleek black Maybach with tinted windows, became their mobile confession booth. Every morning at 7 sharp, the driver opened the door, and Elena slid onto the leather seat. Adrian was always there first, already working, the blue light of his tablet illuminating the sharp angles of his face. The space inside the car was luxurious, designed for comfort, but with 2 people sitting in the back, it felt incredibly intimate. The air was recycled cool, and scented with leather and his cologne. Every time the car turned a corner, gravity conspired to push them together. Elena found herself bracing her leg muscles, digging her heels into the plush floor mats, and fighting the physics that wanted to slide her thigh against his. Adrian never looked up when she entered, but his body reacted. She saw the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his grip tightened on his tablet. The no-touch rule was technically back in full force. He hadn't laid a finger on her since the incident in the boardroom, but the memory of that contact hung in the air between them like thick smoke. It was a phantom limb they both could feel. In the silence of the morning commute, the sound of his breathing seemed amplified. The rustle of his suit jacket when he shifted felt louder than the traffic outside. They were trapped in a bubble of forced proximity, 2 magnets with the same polarity being pushed together by circumstance, the resistance humming in the space between them. As the days turned into weeks, Elena began to notice the cracks in the ice. The Adrian Thorne she knew from the terrified whispers of the staff was a tyrant who didn't care if his employees ate, slept, or breathed, as long as the work was done. But the man sitting next to her in the back seat was different. He was observant in a way that was almost unnerving. It started with the small things. One Tuesday, they were working through lunch to prepare for a merger. Elena had pulled a stale granola bar from her purse, her standard meal when money was tight and time was short. Adrian had been in the middle of a ferocious call with a supplier, his voice a blade cutting through the supplier's excuses. "I don't care about your supply chain issues," he snapped, his tone lethal. "Fix it, or I'll buy your competitor and put you out of business by Friday." He hung up, the cruelty of the threat still lingering in the air. Then, he turned to Elena. His eyes dropped to the granola bar in her hand. "Is that your lunch?" he asked. The venom was gone, replaced by a quiet, brooding frown. "Yes, sir. I'm fine. I just need to finish this. Throw it away." "Excuse me? It looks like sawdust," he said, picking up the internal line to his personal chef. 2 grilled salmon fillets, roasted vegetables, and send up that tart she was looking at in the cafeteria yesterday. 10 minutes. He hung up and went back to his work without acknowledging her stunned silence. It was a bizarre form of care, authoritative, controlling, but undeniably thoughtful. He had noticed her looking at a dessert in the cafeteria. When? He barely looked at anyone. These moments began to pile up. When it rained, he ensured the car pulled up to the curb so precisely that she wouldn't have to step in a puddle. When they worked late, he ordered the driver to take her all the way to her apartment door and wait until she was inside, even though it added 40 minutes to his own commute. He never touched her. He never handed her a coffee directly. He placed it on the desk. He never held the door. He stepped back and let the electronic sensor do the work. But he was touching every other part of her life. He was wrapping her in a layer of protection that money and power could buy, creating a safe distance where he could look after her without breaking his own rule. Elena watched him during meetings. She saw him decimate opponents with cold logic, stripping men of their dignity with a few well-placed sentences. The world saw a monster. But Elena, sitting just behind his right shoulder, saw the way he rubbed his temples when the headaches started. She saw the way he stared out the window when he thought no one was looking, an expression of profound, aching loneliness etched onto his face. The rule wasn't about arrogance. It wasn't that he thought he was too good to be touched. It was fear. It was a man holding himself together with sheer will, terrified that a single crack in the armor would let the floodwaters in. He was a prisoner in his own tower, and she was the only one who had been given the keys to the gate. The tension came to a head on a Thursday night. The office was deserted, the cleaning crews long gone. The only light came from the desk lamp in Adrian's office, casting a pool of gold in the surrounding darkness. They were reviewing a contract for the impending merger, a document worth $300 million. Elena was standing beside his chair, leaning over the desk to point out a clause in the fine print. "Here," she said, her voice soft in the quiet room. "Section 4, paragraph B. The liability clause is too broad." Adrian leaned in to see where she was pointing. He was tired. His defenses were down. For a moment, he forgot the geometry of the distance he usually maintained. He leaned closer, his focus on the words, his face inches from her arm. "I see it," he murmured. "Good catch. We need to strike that." He reached for the red pen lying on the contract. At the same moment, Elena reached to turn the page. It was an accident of timing, a collision of intent. Their hands moved into the same space. They didn't even make full contact. The tips of her fingers barely grazed the back of his hand, a touch lighter than a feather, a mere whisper of skin against skin. The reaction was immediate and violent. Adrian didn't just pull his hand away. He flinched as if she had pressed a branding iron into his flesh. His chair screeched against the hardwood floor as he shoved himself backward, the sound piercing the quiet night. He stood up so fast he nearly knocked the lamp over. "Don't!" The word was torn out of him, ragged and harsh. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving beneath his shirt. He clutched his hand to his chest, cradling it as if it were broken. His eyes were wide, fixed on her, but there was no anger in them. There was no disgust. There was pain. He looked like he was in physical agony, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. The air in the room crackled with a terrifying energy. Elena stood frozen, her hands still hovering in the air, her heart pounding. "Adrian?" she whispered, using his first name for the first time without thinking. He looked at her, his gaze wild, darting over her face. He looked like a man starving to death who had just been offered a feast he knew was poison. The conflict in his eyes, the desperate want warring with the ingrained terror, was heartbreaking. "Leave the file," he choked out. He backed away from her, putting the desk, the chair, and half the room between them. "Just leave it." He didn't wait for her to respond. He turned and walked out of his own office, his strides long and frantic, fleeing the room as if it were on fire. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Elena standing alone in the pool of golden light, the echo of his panic bouncing off the glass walls. She looked at her own hand, her fingers tingling from the phantom brush, and realized with a sinking heart that the Ice King wasn't made of ice at all. He was burning alive, and he was terrified that if he touched her, he would take her down with him. Friday arrived with a brittle tension in the air, the memory of Adrian's flight the night before hanging over the office like a storm cloud. He had returned to his fortress of solitude, the door to his inner sanctum firmly shut. Elena worked in the outer office. The silence from his end was more unnerving than any reprimand. The quiet was shattered at 2 p.m. with the arrival of Marcus Vane. Vane was the CEO of a rival tech firm, a man whose reputation for predatory business practices was only matched by his reputation for predatory personal behavior. He was here to discuss a potential partnership, a deal worth millions that the board was desperate to close. He swept into the reception area with an entourage of sycophants, his cologne announcing his presence before he even spoke. He was loud, expansive, and fundamentally incapable of understanding personal boundaries. "You must be the new gatekeeper," Thane boomed, stopping in front of Elena's desk. He leaned over, planting his hands on the polished wood, invading her workspace. His eyes raked over her, lingering in places that made her skin crawl. "They said Thorne hired a looker this time. They weren't lying. Mr. Thorne is expecting you, Mr. Vane," Elena said, keeping her voice professional and cool. She stood up to guide him toward the conference room, clutching her tablet to her chest like armor. If you'll follow me. Vane didn't move. Instead, he stepped into her path, cutting off her route. He was too close. Much too close. What's the rush, sweetheart? Thorne will make me wake anyway. It's his power move. Why don't you keep me company? He reached out and took her arm. It wasn't a violent grip, but it was possessive. His fingers, thick and damp, wrapped around her bicep, his thumb rubbing against the fabric of her blouse. The contact was repulsive. It was everything Adrian's touch hadn't been. Where Adrian's accidental hold had felt like fire and electricity, Vane's touch felt like oil, slick, suffocating, and dirty. Please let go of me, Mr. Vane, Elena said, her voice tight. She tried to pull her arm back, but he held fast, a smirk playing on his lips. Feisty, he laughed, leaning closer, his breath hot on her face. I like that. Thorne is too cold for a girl like you. Maybe you should come work for me. I'm much more hands-on. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. She was trapped. If she made a scene, she could jeopardize the deal. If she slapped him, she would be fired. She was freezing up, the prey instinct kicking in, when the temperature in the room suddenly dropped to absolute zero. The door to Adrian's office didn't just open, it flew inward with a crash. Adrian stood in the doorway. He wasn't wearing his usual mask of indifference. He looked like a predator who had just scented blood in his den. His eyes were black pits of fury, fixed solely on Vane's hand gripping Elena's arm. The silence that fell over the room was terrifying. Adrian walked forward. He moved with a lethal grace, silent and fast, crossing the distance in 3 strides. Get your hand off her. The voice wasn't loud. It was a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the floorboards. It was the sound of a wolf warning an intruder. Vane blinked, startled, but didn't immediately let go. He turned to Adrian with a practiced, oily smile. Thorne, just getting acquainted with your staff. You didn't tell me you were hoarding talent like this. Adrian didn't smile. He didn't blink. He stopped 2 feet from them, his entire body radiating a menacing energy that made Vane's entourage take a collective step back. I said, Adrian repeated, each syllable a razor blade. Remove your hand. Now. Vane, sensing the genuine danger in the air, finally released Elena. He held his hands up in a mock surrender, chuckling nervously. All right. No need to get territorial, Adrian. It's just a little fun. Now about the merger, get out, Adrian said. Vane's smile faltered. Excuse me? The deal is dead, Adrian said, his voice flat and final. Get out of my building. If I ever see you touch one of my employees again, I won't just cancel the contract. I will buy your company, strip it for parts, and leave you with nothing but the suit on your back. Do you understand me? The room gasped. This was a multi-million-dollar deal. To torch it over a secretary's comfort was corporate suicide. Vane's face flushed red with anger. You can't be serious. You're throwing away $50 million because I touched her arm? She's just a secretary, Thorne. Adrian stepped closer, invading Vane's space, towering over him. For a second, Elena thought he was going to hit him. She is not just anything, Adrian hissed. She is off limits. To you. To everyone. Leave. Now. Vane sputtered, looked at Adrian's murderous expression, and decided that $50 million wasn't worth a physical altercation he would clearly lose. He signaled his team, shot a glare at Elena, and stormed out. The elevator doors dinged shut, leaving a stunned silence in their wake. Adrian didn't move until the elevator was gone. Then, he turned to Elena. The fury was still rolling off him in waves. His chest was heaving, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He looked wild, his hair slightly disheveled, his eyes burning. He cornered her against the reception desk, blocking her in, his body forming a barrier between her and the rest of the world. Did he hurt you? He demanded, his voice ragged. No, Elena breathed, still in shock. Adrian, the deal, the board. To hell with the board, he shouted, the loss of control shocking them both. He slammed his hand onto the desk beside her hip, caging her in. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. I don't care about the money. Did he hurt you? He was trembling. The man who was made of ice was vibrating with adrenaline. He looked at her arm, where Vane had grabbed her. He reached out. Elena held her breath. His hand moved toward her face, his fingers splayed. He looked like he wanted to wipe the memory of Vane's touch off her skin. He wanted to claim her, to overwrite the violation with his own mark. His hand hovered millimeters from her cheek. She could feel the heat radiating from his palm. She could see the conflict raging in his eyes, the desperate need to comfort her warring with the terrified rule that governed his life. "He shouldn't have touched you," Adrian whispered, his voice cracking. "No one touches you. That's the new rule. No one touches you but—" He trailed off, the unfinished sentence hanging in the air between them like a promise or a threat. His fingers trembled, agonizingly close to her skin. The air was charged, magnetic. If she leaned forward 1 inch, she would bridge the gap. If she moved, she would break him. "But who?" she whispered. Adrian stared at her lips, then back to her eyes. He looked like he was about to shatter. He slowly, painfully, curled his fingers into a fist and pulled his hand back. He didn't touch her, but the look in his eyes said he had touched her 1,000 times in his mind. "Go home, Elena," he said hoarsely, stepping back and turning away before he could lose the battle. "Take the car. Go home." She thought she was just a buffer for the gala, but the choice she makes on the dance floor would force the Ice King to reveal his darkest secret, one that he had hidden for a decade. The invitation had been placed on her desk with the same sterile precision as a quarterly report, but the contents were anything but routine. The Thorne Enterprises annual gala. It was the social event of the season, a black-tie masquerade of wealth and influence held in the city's grandest ballroom. Attendance was mandatory for senior executives. For a secretary, it was unheard of. Yet the note attached to the heavy cream card was written in Adrian's sharp, angular handwriting. "I need a buffer. 8 p.m. Do not be late." Later that afternoon, a courier arrived with a long, flat box wrapped in matte black paper. Elena opened it in the privacy of her small apartment, her breath catching in her throat. Inside lay a gown of midnight blue velvet. It wasn't the flashy, revealing kind of dress that screamed for attention. It was elegant, modest, with long sleeves and a high neck, but the cut was devastating. It was designed to skim every curve, to drape like liquid shadow. It was a dress chosen by a man who had spent months watching her from behind glass, a man who knew the exact shape of her silhouette. There was no note this time, just the dress, silent proof that he saw her. When she arrived at the venue, the noise was a physical wall. Hundreds of voices, the clinking of crystal, the swell of a live orchestra. It was a sensory overload. The ballroom was a sea of diamonds and designer tuxedos. Elena hesitated at the entrance, feeling like an imposter in her velvet skin. Then she saw him. Adrian stood near the center of the room, a dark island in a glittering ocean. He wore a tuxedo that fit him like a second skin, the black fabric absorbing the light around him. He looked bored, dangerous, and utterly alone despite the crowd. As soon as she entered, his head snapped up. It was as if he had a radar tuned specifically to her frequency. He didn't smile, but his shoulders dropped an inch. The tension that held him rigid seemed to dissipate the moment he locked eyes with her. He navigated through the crowd, parting the sea of socialites with nothing but his presence, until he was standing in front of her. "You're here," he said. His voice was low, pitched perfectly to slide under the noise of the party. "You ordered me to be," Elena replied, fighting the urge to smooth the velvet of her dress. "Is this acceptable?" His eyes traveled down the length of her body, slow and deliberate. The heat of his gaze felt like a physical caress. "It's adequate," he lied. The pulse jumping in his throat told a different story. "Stay close to me. Do not wander off." For the next 2 hours, Elena became his shadow. The gala was a battlefield of small talk and networking, and she was his shield. Whenever a socialite approached with hungry eyes, Adrian would shift, angling his body so that Elena was between them. Whenever a business partner tried to clap him on the shoulder, he would step back, using Elena's presence as a natural barrier. They moved through the room in a phantom dance, a choreography of perfect synchronization. When he turned left, she turned left. When he stopped, she stopped. They never touched, not once, but the air between them was so charged it felt solid. It was an intimacy that transcended physical contact. In a room full of people screaming to be heard, they existed in a private bubble of silence. They communicated in glances. A tilt of his head was meant to get me out of this conversation. A narrowing of her eyes meant that the investor was lying to you. They were a single organism with two bodies, connected by an invisible tether that pulled taut every time the crowd tried to separate them. Elena noticed the way people looked at them. They were confused. The Ice King, who usually spent these events standing by the exit with a drink he never touched, was now orbiting a woman. He was leaning down to hear her whisper, his ear inches from her lips. He was guarding her back against the crush of the crowd. The no-touch rule was still in effect, but to any observer, it looked like the most intense form of foreplay imaginable. The restraint was louder than the act itself. "I hate these things," Adrian murmured, leaning close as they stood near a towering ice sculpture. The cold from the ice mirrored the chill he projected to the room, but the warmth radiating from his body was suffocatingly real to Elena. "Only one more hour, sir," she whispered back. "Then you can retreat to your fortress." "It's not a fortress," he corrected, his voice tinged with a dark humor. "It's a sanctuary, and it's lonely." The confession hung between them, stark and vulnerable. Before Elena could respond, the tempo of the music changed. The orchestra swelled into a slow, melodic waltz. The chatter in the room died down as couples began to drift toward the dance floor. A spotlight swept across the room, landing, inevitably, on the CEO. A hush fell over the crowd. Tradition. The host always danced the first waltz. It was a stupid, archaic rule, but in the world of high society, breaking tradition was a sign of weakness. A woman in a red dress, the daughter of a banking magnate, stepped forward, a predatory smile on her lips, ready to claim the honor. Adrian froze. He looked at the woman's extended hand with genuine panic. To refuse her was an insult. To touch her was impossible. He was cornered, his breath hitched, his eyes darting for an escape route that didn't exist. Then, he looked at Elena. It was a look of desperation, a silent plea. "Save me." Elena didn't think. She stepped forward, cutting off the woman in red. "I believe," she said, her voice trembling but clear enough for the circle to hear, "that Mr. Thorne promised the first dance to his executive assistant." The lie hung in the air. The woman in red scowled and retreated. The spotlight stayed on them. The orchestra waited. The entire room held its breath. Adrian looked down at her. He knew what this meant. To dance, he had to touch her. Publicly. Deliberately. Not an accident, not a reflex to save her from falling. A choice. He hesitated. His hand twitched at his side. He looked at his own fingers, then at her waist. The fear was there, potent and paralyzing. But the look in her eyes, the trust, the absolute certainty that she wouldn't let him fall, seemed to anchor him. Slowly, agonizingly, he raised his hand. He wasn't wearing gloves. His palm was bare. He extended it toward her, the space between them shrinking to nothing. The audience watched, unaware of the war being fought in his mind, only seeing the romantic gesture. But Elena saw the tremor. She saw the bravery it took for him to reach across the abyss. "May I?" he whispered, the words rough. It wasn't just an invitation to dance. It was a question. "Can I touch you without breaking?" Elena nodded. "Yes." When his skin finally met hers, the sensation wasn't just a touch. It was a collision of worlds. Adrian's fingers closed around Elena's hand. His palm was hot, dry, and trembling with a tension so fine it felt like a vibration running through a high-voltage wire. For a split second, both of them stopped breathing. The ambient noise of the gala, the whispers, the clinking glass, the rustle of silk, vanished into a vacuum. There was only the point of contact, his skin against hers, a connection that felt illicit and inevitable. It was a shockwave that traveled up her arm and settled deep in her chest, a thudding realization that the barrier was down. The iron rule had been breached not by accident, but by choice. He didn't pull away. Instead, he stepped in. He closed the remaining distance with a jerky, determined movement, his other hand coming up to find its place. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before placing his palm on the small of her back. It was the exact same spot where he had caught her weeks ago in the boardroom. The memory of that frantic grip layered over the present reality, creating a sensory echo that made Elena's knees weak. Through the velvet of her dress, his hand felt like a brand. He pulled her closer, not into a polite society hold, but into a frame that was rigid, desperate, and possessive. The music swelled. They began to move. At first, it was like dancing with a statue. Adrian's body was stiff, his muscles coiled tight as if he were expecting an attack. He moved mechanically, guiding her through the steps of the waltz with technical perfection but zero fluidity. He was counting the beats, his eyes fixed on a point over her shoulder, refusing to look at her. He was enduring the touch, fighting the instinct to recoil. "Breathe," Elena whispered, her hand squeezing his shoulder gently. "Just breathe, Adrian." The sound of his name on her lips seemed to snap a wire inside him. His gaze dropped, locking onto hers. The gray of his eyes was turbulent, a storm of conflicting emotions. He took a shuddering breath, and as he exhaled, the rigidity began to melt. His grip on her hand shifted, his fingers lacing through hers, palm to palm, pressing tight. His hold on her waist softened, becoming less of a clamp and more of an embrace. They began to glide. The stiffness vanished, replaced by a fluid, hypnotic rhythm. They moved as one entity, sweeping across the polished floor in wide, elegant arcs. The crowd around them blurred into a meaningless wash of color. The hundreds of watching eyes ceased to matter. In the center of the ballroom, under the cascading light of the chandeliers, they were the only two people left on earth. Adrian leaned down, his head dipping low until his cheek was almost brushing her temple. "I hate them," he murmured, his voice a rough vibration against her ear. "The investors?" Elena asked softly, following his lead as he spun her. "Everyone," he confessed, the words spilling out like a secret he had kept for a lifetime. "I hate the noise. I hate the lies. I hate that they want pieces of me." His hand tightened on her waist, pulling her flush against him for a brief, daring moment. "I hate everyone in this room, except you." Elena's heart skipped a beat. The confession was raw, stripped of his usual corporate armor. He wasn't the CEO anymore. He was just a man, holding on to her as if she were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. "I'm here," she whispered back. "I've got you." "I know," he said. "That's the problem." The dance continued, but the atmosphere shifted. The tenderness began to curdle into something more volatile. The heat between them was rising, becoming suffocating. Adrian was no longer just tolerating the touch, he was drowning in it. His thumb began to stroke the velvet of her dress, a subconscious, rhythmic caress that sent shivers down Elena's spine. His eyes darkened, losing the focus of the dance, becoming consumed by the proximity of her mouth and the scent of her skin. He was losing control. The carefully constructed walls of his phobia were crumbling, but what lay behind them wasn't just fear. It was a hunger so intense it terrified him. He abruptly stopped. They were in the middle of a turn. The music was still playing, the other couples still swirling around them. But Adrian had frozen. He stared down at her, his chest heaving, his face pale. He looked like he had just realized he was standing on the edge of a cliff. The sensory overload, the smell of her, the feel of her hand, the heat of her body, had redlined his system. "I can't," he choked out. He released her as if she had suddenly turned into fire. He stepped back, stumbling slightly, his hands balling into fists at his sides. The loss of contact was physically painful, a cold snap that left Elena shivering. "Adrian?" She reached out, but he was already moving. He turned on his heel and walked away. He didn't walk with his usual confident stride. He fled. He pushed through the confused dancers, ignoring the calls of his name and the murmurs that rippled through the crowd. He headed straight for the French doors that led to the terrace, disappearing into the night without looking back. Elena stood alone on the dance floor, her hands still raised, the ghost of his touch burning her skin. The music seemed to distort, the beauty of the waltz twisting into something tragic. She didn't care about the staring eyes. She didn't care about the protocol. She gathered her skirts and ran after him. The terrace was dark, the noise of the party muffled by the heavy glass doors. The night air was cool, biting at her exposed skin. She found him at the far end of the balcony, where the stone railing overlooked the city lights. He was gripping the stones so hard his knuckles were white. He was bent over, his head hanging low, gasping for air. It wasn't just panic, it was a full-blown attack. He was hyperventilating, his body shaking violently. The Ice King was shattered. Elena stopped 10 feet away. She saw the tremor in his spine. She realized then that the no-touch rule wasn't about power. It wasn't about control. It was a desperate dam holding back a reservoir of trauma so deep it threatened to drown him. He wasn't afraid of germs. He was afraid of feeling. He was afraid that if he started to feel, he would never be able to stop. She stood there, the wind whipping the hem of her velvet dress. She had a choice. The rule was back in place. He had run away to re-establish the boundary. She could turn around, go back inside, and let him rebuild his walls. Or she could cross the line. She took a step forward. Her heel clicked on the stone. Adrian flinched but didn't turn around. "Don't," he rasped, his voice broken. "Don't come closer, Elena. Please." It was the first time he had ever said please. It broke her heart. She took another step, then another, until she was standing right behind him, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his trembling body. She raised her hand, hovering it over his back, terrified and determined. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I said don't." Adrian's voice was a ragged edge, but he didn't move away. He stayed rooted to the spot, gripping the cold stone railing as if it were the only thing tethering him to the earth. His breathing was still erratic, shallow gasps that tore through the silence of the balcony. Elena didn't retreat. She stood in the space he had tried to forbid, her presence a quiet defiance. "I'm not leaving you like this," she said softly. "You can fire me tomorrow, but tonight I'm not leaving." Adrian let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He slowly turned around, leaning back against the railing, sliding down until he was sitting on the cold stone floor of the terrace. He looked wrecked. His tie was undone, his hair chaotic, and his eyes wide and haunted. The powerful CEO who commanded boardrooms with a glance was gone. In his place was a man who looked like he had been hollowed out. "It's too much," he whispered, pressing the heels of his hands into his eyes. "There's always too much noise." Elena lowered herself to the ground, sitting cross-legged a few feet away from him. She was careful not to encroach on his immediate space, but she was close enough to be an anchor. "What is it?" "Touch," he said, the words sounding like a curse. He dropped his hands, looking at her with a bleak honesty she had never seen before. "For you, for everyone else, touch is just a sensation. It's background data. For me, it's a scream." He looked out at the city skyline, avoiding her gaze as he began to speak, the dam finally breaking. "It's not just a quirk, Elena. It's a defect. Since I was a child, my brain, it doesn't filter. When someone touches me, I don't just feel skin. I feel their pulse, their heat, their intent. It amplifies. It's like standing next to a jet engine without your protection. It hurts. It physically hurts." He took a shaky breath. "And then, it was quiet. I built the quiet. I built the walls. I made the rules so I could think, so I could function. I decided that if I couldn't handle the noise, I would live in silence. Total, absolute silence." He looked at his hands, turning them over, studying the palms that had held her waist just minutes ago. "My ex-fiancée, she didn't understand. She thought she could fix me. She used touch to manipulate, to force reactions, and to overwhelm me until I agreed to whatever she wanted just to make the sensory overload stop. She weaponized it. When she left, she told me I was broken, that I was unlovable because I couldn't be held without flinching." Elena felt a sharp ache in her chest. The rumors of a germ phobia or arrogance were wrong. It was so much simpler and so much more tragic. He wasn't cold. He was raw. He was a man walking through the world without skin, feeling everything so intensely that he had to numb himself to survive. But tonight, Adrian looked at her then, his eyes searching her face with a desperate confusion. Tonight, when I touched you, it wasn't noise. Elena held her breath. What was it? Music, he whispered. It was a melody. It was the first time in my life that contact didn't scream. It sang. And that. He squeezed his eyes shut again. That is terrifying. Because I can't control it. If I start listening to it, I'll never want the silence back. And I need the silence to survive. The vulnerability in his voice shattered her. He was terrified of her, not because she was a threat, but because she was the cure he didn't think he deserved. Elena made a decision then. She saw the power dynamic clearly. He was the boss, the billionaire, the titan. But in this, he was helpless. He needed control, but not the kind he bought with money. He needed agency. Then we make a new rule, she said firmly. Adrian opened his eyes. What? A reverse rule. She explained, her voice steady. I will never touch you. Not by accident, not to comfort you, not to dance. I will never initiate contact. The only time we touch is if you ask for it. If you initiate it, you have control. You decide when you want the music and when you need the silence. Adrian stared at her. He looked stunned. He was used to people taking from him or people trying to fix him. No one had ever offered to simply stand guard over his boundaries. You would do that? I would, she promised. I'm right here, Adrian. I'm not going to force you. I'm just going to be with you. She didn't move closer. She stayed where she was, bathed in the moonlight, her velvet dress pooling around her. She offered him nothing but her presence, a warmth that bridged the gap without physical contact. For a long time, they just sat there in the shadows of the balcony, the party raging inside, two planets finding a stable orbit. Eventually, the adrenaline faded, leaving exhaustion in its wake. They left the gala through a side exit, avoiding the crowds. The ride home in the back of the Maybach was quiet, but the tension was gone. It was a comfortable silence now. Adrian was drained. The emotional toll of the night, combined with the sensory overload, hit him all at once. His head began to nod. He fought it for a few minutes, blinking heavily, but his body surrendered. Slowly, inevitably, his posture slumped. He leaned to the side. Elena felt the weight settle against her shoulder. She froze. Adrian Thorne, the Ice King, was asleep on her shoulder. His head was heavy, his breathing deep and even, his hair brushed against her neck. It was a violation of the rule she had just proposed, but he had initiated it, even if unconsciously. She didn't move. She barely breathed. She let him sleep, acting as his pillow, his support. The car hummed along the highway, the city lights streaking past. For 20 minutes she held him in the stillness, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest against her arm. As the car slowed for a turn, Adrian stirred. He didn't jerk awake. He shifted, lifting his head slowly. He blinked, realizing where he was. He realized his cheek had been resting on the velvet of her shoulder. He realized he was leaning into her heat. He didn't pull away. He stayed there, hovering inches from her, his eyes half-lidded and soft with sleep. He looked at her, then at her shoulder, then back at her. There was no panic, no flinching, just a quiet acceptance of the fact that he had found a safe place to land. We're almost there, Elena whispered, her heart pounding. I know, he murmured. He stayed close for a moment longer, breathing in her scent, before slowly sitting up and straightening his jacket. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. The fact that he hadn't recoiled was the loudest thing he had ever said. And then, he shattered her. The resignation letter she placed on his desk wasn't just paper. It was a grenade that was about to destroy his silence for good. The morning sun didn't bring clarity. It brought a cold, blinding panic. Adrian woke up with the phantom sensation of Elena's shoulder still pressed against his cheek. For a few drowsy seconds, it was a comfort. Then memory crashed in. The dance, the terrace, the confession, the car. He had cracked open his chest and shown her the raw, bleeding machinery inside. He had let her see the weakness he had spent a decade burying under layers of money and ice. And worse, far worse, he had liked it. He had wanted to stay on her shoulder. He had wanted to burrow into her warmth and never leave. That want was a siren blaring in his head. Dependency. It was the one thing he feared more than the noise. If he needed her to feel normal, then she had the power to destroy him. Just like before. He did what he always did when the fear became too loud. He nuked the bridge. When Elena arrived at the office at 7 a.m., expecting the soft, tentative camaraderie of the night before, she walked into a slaughterhouse of silence. Her access card to the executive suite didn't work. The red light blinked at her, a digital rejection. Confused, she buzzed the intercom. Security. A guard's voice crackled. Miss, your clearance has been updated. You're back in the general pool. Elena felt a cold pit open in her stomach. She took the elevator down, her heart thumping a frantic rhythm. When she reached the outer office, the noisy, crowded floor she thought she had left behind, she saw it. Her desk, her personal items, the framed photo of her sister, her favorite mug, her cactus, were all boxed up and sitting on the generic cubicle she had occupied months ago. She walked to the glass wall of Adrian's office. The blinds were drawn, shut tight. A physical barrier to match the emotional one, he said, effective immediately. The HR director told her, looking apologetic but firm, he wants the executive suite to be a sterile zone again. No support staff inside the perimeter. Elena stood there, clutching her purse, feeling the blood drain from her face. It wasn't just a demotion. It was an erasure. After last night, after she had held him while he shook, after she had promised to be his safe harbor, after he had slept on her shoulder, he was treating her like a contagion. He wasn't just pushing her away, he was incinerating the memory of their closeness. The days that followed were a blur of humiliation. The car service was cancelled. She took the subway. The special lunches stopped. The late-night strategy sessions were replaced by curt emails sent through an intermediary. She saw him only once in the hallway. He looked terrible, pale, with dark circles under his eyes, his jaw set so hard it looked painful. But when he saw her, he didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. He looked straight through her, his eyes dead and cold, as if she were a stranger he had never met. The cruelty of it took Elena's breath away. It was one thing to be distant. It was another to be discarded after being invited in. She realized with a stinging clarity that she had been a fool. She had thought she was saving him. She had thought they were building something. But to Adrian Thorne, she was just another variable that had gotten too close to the core, and he had initiated the emergency shutdown. She wasn't a person to him. She was a trigger. By Thursday, the sadness had hardened into anger. Elena sat in her cubicle, listening to the banal chatter of the office, and looked at the stack of files Adrian had sent down for her to format. Menial work, busy work. It was insulting. She thought of her sister, of the medical bills, of the reason she had stayed this long. But some things were more expensive than money. Her dignity was bleeding out on this gray carpet. She opened a blank document on her computer. Her fingers hovered over the keys, trembling with rage and heartbreak. She typed the date. She typed his name. Dear Mr. Thorne, please accept this letter as formal notification that I am resigning from my position. The words flowed easily, sharp and final. She printed it. She signed it. The paper felt heavy in her hand, a white flag and a declaration of war all at once. She didn't wait for an appointment. She didn't check his schedule. She marched to the elevator, her heels clicking a furious rhythm. She swiped her old pass. It didn't work, so she waited for a junior VP to exit and slipped in before the doors closed. She walked past the startled assistant in the outer rim. She walked straight to the heavy oak doors of the inner sanctum. She didn't knock. She pushed them open. Adrian was on the phone, standing by the window, his back to the room. He spun around at the intrusion, his face darkening with instant fury. I said I am not to be disturbed. He stopped when he saw her. The anger in his eyes flickered, replaced for a nanosecond by something that looked like hunger, before the eyes slammed back down. He lowered the phone, though he didn't hang up. You don't have clearance to be in here, Elena. I don't need clearance, she said, her voice steady despite the shaking of her hands. I'm not an employee anymore. She walked to his desk. The vast expanse of mahogany that had always separated them felt like a canyon. She placed a single sheet of paper in the center of the desk. My resignation, she stated. Effective immediately. You can mail my final check? Adrian stared at the paper. He didn't touch it. He looked at the bold header, resignation, and the color vanished from his face. It was as if she had placed a live grenade between them. You can't, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. He forgot the phone in his hand. He forgot the person on the other end. I can't, Elena said, her eyes burning with unshed tears. I won't be used, Adrian. I won't be your emotional crutch one night, and your garbage the next. You want your silence? You want your empty tower? You can have it. You can have all of it. She turned around. She didn't wait for a counteroffer. She didn't wait for an apology. She knew he was too broken to give. She walked toward the door. Elena, wait. She didn't stop. She grabbed the handle. She was walking out of his life, and the terrifying reality of it hit Adrian with the force of a physical blow. The silence he had fought so hard to protect suddenly sounded deafening. It didn't sound like peace. It sounded like a tomb. The paper on the desk was just ink and fiber, but to Adrian, it looked like a death certificate. Resignation. The word was burned into his retinas. For years, his life had been a series of subtractions. Subtract the noise. Subtract the people. Subtract the risk. He had solved the equation of his existence by removing every variable that could hurt him. He had thought that by pushing Elena away, he was simply rebalancing the formula. He was restoring the order. But looking at her retreating back, watching the only source of warmth in his cold universe walk toward the door, he realized he hadn't balanced anything. He had just emptied the room. The fear of touch was a monster that had lived in his chest for a decade. It whispered that safety lay in isolation, but the fear of losing her? That was new. That was a different kind of beast, sharper and more vicious. It clawed at his throat, choking him. If she walked out that door, the silence wouldn't just be quiet, it would be absolute. It would be the end. Elena! He shouted her name, dropping the phone. It clattered against the desk, the voice on the other end squawking into the void. He didn't care. He scrambled around the desk, his movements frantic and uncoordinated. He was the Ice King no more. He was a desperate man chasing a lifeline. Elena was already through the double doors. She was moving fast, fueled by adrenaline and heartbreak. She reached the elevator bank just as the doors were sliding open. She stepped inside, stabbing the lobby button. "Hold that door!" She heard his voice, ragged and loud, echoing down the corridor. She saw him sprinting toward her. It was a sight that defied logic. Adrian Thorne running. His tie was flying over his shoulder, his face flushed. But Elena didn't want to be caught. She pressed the closed door button repeatedly. The metal doors began to slide shut. He made it. Just as the gap narrowed to a sliver, he jammed his hand between the doors. The sensors triggered, and the doors bounced back open. He stood there, chest heaving, blocking the exit. He looked wild. "You're not leaving. Get out of my way, Adrian," Elena said, backing into the corner of the elevator. "I'm done. I accept your resignation," he gasped, stepping into the car. The doors slid shut behind him, sealing them in the small metal box. The elevator began its descent. "I accept it. You're not my employee anymore. Then let me go." "No." He moved closer, consuming the space between them. "I'm not talking to my secretary. I'm talking to you." The elevator dinged. Lobby level. The doors opened. The lobby was packed. It was lunch hour. Dozens of employees, couriers, and clients were milling about. When the doors opened and revealed the CEO looking disheveled and frantic, cornering a crying woman, the entire atrium went silent. Heads turned. Phones were lowered. Elena tried to push past him. "This is a scene, Adrian. Everyone is watching. Let them watch," he growled. She stepped out into the lobby, trying to lose herself in the crowd. He followed her. He didn't just follow, he reached out. This time, there was no hesitation, no trembling hand hovering millimeters away, no mental calculation of risk. He grabbed her arm, but he didn't stop there. He pulled her back, spinning her around with a force that made her gasp. And then, in front of the reception desk, in front of the security guards, in front of the entire company that knew rule number one as gospel, he shattered it. He wrapped both arms around her and pulled her flush against his body. The contact was a collision. It was a supernova. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, holding her so tight it felt like he was trying to merge their skeletons. A collective gasp rippled through the lobby. This was the man who fired people for handshakes. This was the untouchable idol. And he was clinging to her like a drowning man clinging to driftwood. "Don't go," he mumbled into her skin, his voice shaking so hard she could feel the vibrations in her own bones. "Please, I was wrong. I was scared. I'm so scared, Elena." Elena stood frozen in his embrace, her hands hovering over his back. "You pushed me away," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You treated me like a disease. I was trying to save myself," he confessed, pulling back just enough to look at her. His eyes were wet. "I thought if I let you in, the noise would kill me. But the silence," he shook his head. "The silence without you is worse. It's not peace. It's just lonely. I don't want to be safe if it means being without you. Adrian, everyone is looking," she murmured, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I don't care," he said fiercely. "Let them see. Let them see that I'm done with the rules." He looked at her mouth. The desire that had been simmering for months, the hunger he had suppressed with cold showers and colder glares, finally boiled over. He didn't ask this time. He didn't need a reverse rule. He needed her. He cupped her face in his hands, skin on skin, no barriers, and kissed her. It wasn't a tentative, movie-perfect kiss. It was desperate. It was messy. It was the physical manifestation of a dam breaking. He kissed her like he was starving, devouring the sound of her surprise, tasting the salt of her tears. The sensory overload he had feared for so long crashed into him, but it didn't hurt. It wasn't noisy. It was a symphony. It was the feeling of coming home. Elena melted into him, her hands finally gripping the lapels of his jacket, pulling him closer. The shock of his lips, the heat of his body, the public claiming, it was overwhelming. The lobby erupted into whispers, but neither of them heard it. They were in the center of the storm, but for the first time, Adrian wasn't trying to escape the wind. He was embracing it. He broke the kiss only to rest his forehead against hers, breathing hard, his hands still framing her face as if checking to make sure she was real. "Stay," he whispered against her lips. "Stay and break every rule I have." The silence that followed the kiss in the lobby was different from the silence of the boardroom, or the silence of Adrian's lonely apartment. It wasn't empty. It was full. It was the heavy, breathless quiet of a crowd witnessing the impossible. When they finally pulled apart, Adrian didn't step back. He kept his hands on her face, his thumbs brushing away the tear tracks on her cheeks. He looked at her as if she were the only source of light in the building. He didn't look at the security guards, the receptionists, or the executives gaping by the elevators. He simply took her hand, interlacing their fingers with a deliberate, unbreakable grip. "Let's go upstairs," he said softly. He didn't let go in the elevator. He didn't let go when they walked past her old desk in the general pool. He didn't let go until they were safely inside his office, the heavy door clicking shut behind them. And even then, he only let go to pull her into a hug that lasted for 10 minutes, his face buried in her hair, breathing her in like oxygen. The resignation letter was still sitting on his desk. He picked it up, crumpled it into a ball, and threw it into the trash without a word. "You're not resigning," he murmured against her temple. "But the job description has changed." The weeks that followed were a fascinating study in cause and effect. Thorne Enterprises was still a machine of efficiency. Adrian was still the ice king to the outside world, brilliant, ruthless, and exacting. But the temperature in the building had shifted. The Arctic chill that used to follow him down the hallways had thawed. The staff watched, bewildered at first, then relieved. They noticed the changes. They noticed that when Adrian walked into a room, he would instinctively look for Elena. They noticed that the door to the executive suite, once a sealed vault, was often left ajar. But mostly, they noticed the touch. The no-touch rule had been replaced by a constant, magnetic need for contact. It wasn't performative. It was grounding. It was as if Adrian had spent 30 years holding his breath and was finally learning to exhale. In high-stakes board meetings, while lawyers argued over clauses and millions of dollars were moved across the table, Elena would sit to his right. To the room, Adrian was a statue of intimidation, listening with a critical eye. But under the heavy oak table, out of sight, his hand rested on her knee, or his fingers were tangled with hers. He needed that connection to filter the noise. Her skin against his was the static grounding wire that kept the sensory overload at bay. Whenever the tension in the room spiked, Elena would squeeze his hand, a silent signal. "I'm here. You're safe." And she would watch the tension drain from his shoulders, his focus sharpening. He became possessive in a way that was quiet and absolute. When they walked to the car, his hand was always on the small of her back, guiding her, shielding her. When he read documents at her desk, he would lean over her shoulder, his chest pressing against her back, resting his chin on her head. He treated her touch like medicine. One rainy Tuesday in November, 3 months after the lobby incident, the change was solidified. They were at a charity dinner, another event he would have previously despised. A waiter accidentally bumped into Adrian, spilling wine near his sleeve. The old Adrian would have recoiled, humiliated the server, and left. The new Adrian flinched, his eyes squeezing shut for a second as the unexpected contact jarred his system. But before the panic could set in, Elena's hand was on his forearm. "It's okay," she whispered, her thumb rubbing a soothing circle on his skin. "Just an accident. Look at me." He opened his eyes. He looked at her. The noise in his head quieted. He nodded, took a breath, and simply waved the terrified waiter away. "It's fine," he said gruffly. "Just bring a napkin." The table stared. The Ice King had shown mercy. But Elena knew it wasn't mercy, it was regulation. He wasn't alone in the noise anymore. The real story, however, wasn't in the public displays or the office politics. It was in the quiet moments that no one else saw. It was late on a Sunday evening. The city outside the penthouse windows was a grid of golden lights, obscured by the soft patter of rain against the glass. The apartment, once a cold museum of modern art and silence, was warm. Elena sat on the oversized velvet sofa, a book resting on her lap. Adrian was lying next to her, his long frame taking up most of the couch. His head was in her lap, his eyes closed. This was their new normal. He sought her out like a heat-seeking missile. He needed to be tangled with her to recharge. She ran her fingers through his dark hair, scratching lightly at his scalp. He let out a low, contented hum, the sound vibrating against her thigh. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated peace. "Are you asleep?" she whispered, turning a page of her book. "No," he mumbled, not opening his eyes. "Just listening." "To what?" "To the quiet," he said. He reached up, finding her free hand blindly, and brought it to his lips. He kissed her knuckles, then pressed her palm against his cheek, holding it there like a lifeline. "It used to be so loud, Elena. Everything was so loud. Now, it's just you. You're the only thing I hear." Elena looked down at him. The sharp lines of his face had softened in the dim light. The defensive furrow between his brows was gone. He looked younger. He looked happy. She thought back to that day in the boardroom. The terrifying moment her heel had snapped. The rush of gravity. The expectation of pain. She remembered the shock of his arm around her waist, the first time he had broken his own law to save her. He had caught her when she was falling, terrified that the contact would break him, but unable to let her hit the ground. She smiled, tracing the line of his jaw with her thumb. He shifted closer, burying his face in the soft fabric of her sweater, his arm wrapping tighter around her waist even in his half-sleep. He had caught her then. But looking at him now, at peace, safe, and finally unafraid, she realized the dynamic had shifted. He wasn't the strong one anymore, and he didn't have to be. He had spent a lifetime building walls to keep the world out, but she had become the foundation that allowed him to tear them down. She leaned down and kissed his forehead. "Go to sleep, Adrian. I've got you." And she did. He had caught her when she fell, but she was the one holding him up now. And for the first time in his life, Adrian Thorne wasn't afraid to let go. Adrian finally found his quiet place, not in an empty room, but in her arms. If this story gave you those butterflies we all chase, or if you just loved seeing the Ice King finally melt, please hit that like button. It's the best way to tell me you want more stories exactly like this one. And I have a question for you. If you were Elena standing on that balcony, and he told you to stay away, would you have crossed the line like she did? Or would you have let him go? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one, and I'd love to know what you would have done. Subscribe and turn on the bell if you want this channel to be your escape after a long day. We have so many more secrets left to tell. Until next time, sweet dreams.